All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. We're just waiting a few minutes. The event is scheduled to start at 12, but there was a piece on the Hill overnight that said it was starting at 12:15. So we're trying to balance a little bit for anyone that got the hashtag fake news on that one. So I'm Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of ITIF and Director of our Center for Data Innovation. For those of you who don't know ITIF, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank, and I lead our tech policy portfolio. So I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Opt-in Requirements, the Hidden Red Tape of Privacy Laws. And the goal here is really to have a conversation and a debate about the different approaches to providing consumer choice on privacy. So just before we begin, a few logistics. First, the event is being recorded and webcast. So if you're in the room, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Yeah, we're having some audio problems that are hopefully getting worked out. All right. So I'll repeat that again. The event is being recorded and webcast, so privacy notice for everyone in the room. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, but if you are watching the stream online, you can also ask questions using the hashtag ITIF privacy. So to kind of start us off, I mean, this privacy issue, it's a perennial policy issue that we see come up, but it's certainly an important one. Every time policymakers propose new privacy laws that would impose rules and restrictions on how companies or government agencies collect information, one of the first decisions they have to make is whether to make the privacy rules opt-in or opt-out. So opt-in means you require the organization to get affirmative consent from the individual before collecting information about them, and opt-out means the organization can collect at will unless the individual opts out of that and says not to. It turns out these decisions have a significant impact on the availability and use of data. And this is particularly true in the online space, where the internet ecosystem has been built on this financial model of free and low-cost apps and services that depend on the availability of targeted online ads that use this personal information. So in general, if you look at it from the internet innovation perspective, opt-in rules are bad for two reasons. First of all, obtaining consent is expensive. When you look at most of the studies around this, the cost of obtaining consent can be high. And when you're dealing with low-value information, so when you look at the actual value of any one person, any one user's personal data, that's actually very low, and the cost of collection relative to that individual user is actually, it's quite a strong ratio there. So in the best case scenario, this means companies have less money to invest in new products and services. And the worst case scenario means you have companies that are actually shutting down sites, shutting down services, or they're moving to a pay model, a pay-per-use model that really, of course, has a negative impact on low-income users. The second problem is that it's not user-friendly. So, of course, you have some users that really value their privacy. You have some users that don't put a huge premium on that. And then you have most of us that are somewhere in the middle where we're willing to make certain trade-offs. Opt-in rules are really designed for that small group of people that really value their privacy. What's interesting here is that when you compare the opt-in approach and the opt-out approach, in both of those situations, that small group of what Alan Weston, the privacy reacher, has called the privacy fundamentalist, in both of those situations, that group actually has their needs met. Because in the opt-in scenario, of course, their privacy is being protected by default in that sense. But in the opt-out scenario, they're the ones with the strongest motivation to actually go and take the steps to opt out. So they have the incentive and they have the value, and they're the ones that are likely to take those steps. But for the majority, those who are making these trade-offs without these strong preferences, they're going to be the ones that are more likely to stay with the default option. And that's why we should be really having a conversation about what that default option should be. Kind of beyond the initial question of opt-in versus opt-out, some policy proposals on opt-in go a step further. They want users to be able to basically have their cake and eat it too. They want to they want to prohibit companies from being able to condition access to a site or service based on whether the individual agrees to their privacy terms. So to me, this is kind of the pinnacle of absurdity here, given that data is how these businesses actually monetize their services. A rule like this is kind of equivalent to saying a restaurant or a coffee shop still has to serve their customers, even if the customer disagrees with the prices on the menu. This really gets to the kind of core idea here in a free market. It also encourages free riding, and not only kind of encourages it, but it basically says that free riding would be legal. So, in short, opt-in rules are unnecessarily prioritizing the needs of the individual ahead of the needs of the community. And I think that's what's kind of left out of this conversation. And when you kind of look at some of the rhetoric in this debate, it's really always about what does the individual want. And part of what we're trying to ask in this conversation is what's good for the internet community overall, what's good for consumers in aggregate, and can we look at both of those when we're considering these different roles? But of course, this debate's been going on for quite a while, and we want to continue that today. We have a fantastic set of panelists here today to kind of share with us their expertise and to talk about these different issues. Starting on my far right, John Verde is Vice President of Policy at the Future Privacy Forum and former Director of Privacy Initiatives at NTIA. Continuing to the left, Kara Sutton is Senior Manager at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Center for Global Regulatory Cooperation and former Policy Director of the Transatlantic Business Council. To my left is Howard Beals, Associate Professor of Strategic Management and Public Policy at George Washington University and former Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the FTC. And then Abigail Slater, General Counsel at the Internet Association and a former enforcement attorney at the FTC and attorney advisor for the former Commissioner Julie Brill. So thanks to all of you for being here today. I've asked kind of everyone to kind of kick us off with some comments around this question of, do consumers have enough control of their privacy today? John, why don't you start?
So I think it's a great question, and I think if you asked a range of privacy advocates that question, the answer would be a resounding no. I think if you asked consumers that question in just the way that you asked it to me, that the majority of consumers would say no. When I look at this question, I try to look at both what consumers say and what consumers do, right? I look at what regulators say, what regulators do, and I look at what companies say and what companies do. And I think that it's probably uncontroversial to say that in the privacy space, like in many aspects of our economy here in the U.S., the controls that consumers have over their data or over any number of other choices that they exercise day to day are imperfect, right? I think it's very hard to build perfect controls for really vast user bases that differ in education, engagement, interest, a variety of different factors. So I think it's not a surprise that those controls are imperfect for some. I think by and large what you see are major internet companies investing a tremendous amount of resources, time, effort, expertise, technical resources in providing consumers with effective controls. I think you see other businesses trying to do the same. And I think you see some folks who provide the bare minimum of controls that are legally required. So I do think you see a diversity. I don't think it's a monolith of do consumers have appropriate controls? Do consumers have effective controls? I think the answer to that is necessarily going to be mixed.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you to kind of expand a little bit more on that in terms of, because as you said, there's a range of options. So where you see it working, kind of why do you think it's working there? And what kind of led to that success? And where you don't see it working, what would you want to see it change? Are you saying that it's just a question of time that companies are investing in this, or there's something else going on there?
Sure. So I think it's probably a variety of things. I think it's hard to answer that in one way. Where is it working well, and why is it working well in those circumstances? Well, it's working well in circumstances where companies dedicate the resources. So you see, Google has privacy dashboards. Facebook does a privacy checkup with users, which has really driven engagement with those privacy tools on that platform, as compared with passive options for permissions and things like that. When you look in the mobile space, you see companies like Apple and Google responding to consumer demand, responding to the desires of app developers to try to balance how best to provide consumer controls. So one of the things we've seen in the development of the mobile space over the last 5 to 8 years was that it originally started with a permissions model that was driven by consumers largely being presented with choices immediately before the download of an app, or if at some other time immediately after the download of an app. They were presented with a lot of information about what information apps would collect and how they sought to use it. And then consumers would have to make a yes or no choice. And I think that those permissions models on mobile devices have become much more sophisticated. Consumers have opportunities at the operating system level to make really granular choices about certain sensitive data categories. And mobile platforms have been providing just-in-time notifications. They've been trying to present consumers with information and choices at the times that are most salient to them in that flow. So rather than telling a user before they download an app and they've even experienced what the app has to offer, hey, this app is going to collect and share location information in the following way. Now, many apps and many operating systems are presenting information about location sharing at the crucial moment when the app collects or shares that location, which tends to drive up engagement, it tends to be much more salient for users, and it tends to result in much more meaningful choices. So, I mean, that's just a couple of examples when you talk about privacy dashboards, when you talk about just-in-time notifications, when you talk about more sophisticated approaches to granular privacy settings. I think those are some of the areas where privacy controls are working well, again, not perfectly for everyone, but are working better than they did in the past.
Great. Thanks, John. And for those of you who are just joining us, there are some seats on the side. There's some seats in the front. We have a couple of
come, join us. We won't bite.
You're welcome to come up front. So, Kara, basically the same question to you. I mean, when this is a debate that's been going on for a long time. Do consumers have sufficient control over their privacy, and how has it changed, over the last few years?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to kind of privacy rights is really balance. You want to find that balance between the right to privacy as well as the ability to benefit from the information. And I think that's also kind of a personal choice we all make every day when we're choosing if we want to use Facebook or log on or use a banking app. But then it's also kind of a societal decision. And I think that's really important to look at it as well as how much should we protect that right to privacy and then still balance the ability for society to benefit from that information. So I think one of the really important things is kind of when I think about information and data kind of in the economic sense, we kind of think of information as a abundant resource. Anyone can kind of get a hold of information if you kind of put in the effort to get that information. When you're using kind of an opt-out method, to me it's more of kind of the ability to have that information flow more freely. And if you turn to more of kind of an opt-in method, you're looking at potentially kind of fragmenting the ability to use that information in society. So you're kind of dampening that ability for the information to flow. And so I think that, I think we'll get to this later, but kind of ends up impacting some of the benefits that we as a society can have from information, whether it be kind of learning more about our health, bettering society as a whole. Even some of the GDPR is affecting the ability of charities to gather funds and information. So there's a range of benefits. So I think that finding that balance in society is really important, as well as just kind of the normal way that we think about it in terms of consumer privacy and a consumer making that day-to-day choice. And then kind of looking at ways to improve that balance and how to figure out how to meet that balance. I think that really individuals, regulators, and companies have to kind of work together to achieve and understand where that balance is. I think on the one hand, individuals have to really take control of and understand their privacy rights and constantly kind of make that decision of, okay, do I want to have access to this versus kind of protecting my privacy right. I was reading an interesting article the other day about a woman who was pregnant and decided she wanted to try to hide her pregnancy the full 9 months. So she told all her family, don't post anything on Facebook, I don't want any targeted ads coming towards me. And she basically did this experiment to see if by limiting kind of her online presence, she would be able to hide her pregnancy. And so she, after the 9 months, was like, yes, I was successful in doing it. But then I kind of thought about, all the things I missed out on. She had to pay for cash in a lot of different ways. She didn't get access to coupons. I guess a lot of companies send coupons when you're shopping as a pregnant person. So it was just kind of interesting what she was going through, kind of I lost access to all of this by trying to hide my pregnancy from kind of the online world. So I think some of those decisions are always there on the personal side, that each individual has to make, but kind of explaining, why did she want to hide her pregnancy? Was it just kind of an experiment? What does that mean for the greater society as well? And then I think on the regulator side, part of it is really educating society. And then when there are privacy laws, really enforcing those regulations. So I think the FTC is known for enforcing and doing a great job with enforcement, but a lot of people kind of criticize sometimes the European system, and especially its 95 directive that kind of moved towards an opt-in method, but actually not every country implemented it that way because they recognize that their society wouldn't benefit fully from a complete opt-in system. And so I think that education and that enforcement is another aspect. And then I think the final one is really kind of what John was talking about, and really companies making sure that their consumers understand privacy. And really in a free market system, if we look at it, if consumers really value their privacy, then those companies that are shown to be protectors of privacy are going to do better in the market. And giving that ability for competition in the end really benefits society as a whole as well.
Great, thanks, Kara. Howard, I want to turn to you. I mean, when you were at the FTC, you were there when probably the biggest opt-out policy, do not call, went into effect. How are things changing in terms of consumer control, and what lessons can we learn from those experiences?
Well, the whole opt-out experience for do not call came from the notion that approaching privacy based on fair information practices is really an approach that's fundamentally flawed. It doesn't work because consumers don't read notices. There's important information systems that would collapse if we really allowed choice. So it ends up being a set of principles that applies except when it doesn't. And that's not a very useful way to think about privacy. What makes a lot more sense is to think about what are the problems we're trying to fix. And in the case of do not call, it was telephone calls that people didn't want to get. Trying to keep your phone number secret won't work. That's not an approach that's going to keep you from getting any telephone calls. Giving you the ability to control that particular use of information, that helps people avoid the annoyance of telemarketing calls, or at least it did for a while. I think the fundamental insight of the way we approached it is the whole opt-in, opt-out debate assumes that this is a contract question, that somebody's got a property right here, and that they can transfer it to somebody else if they choose to do that. In contrast, I think it makes much more sense to think about this as a tort problem. Is there something that somebody is doing with information that is causing some harm and causing some problem that we want to try to fix? And if so, we ought to try to stop it. The contract model makes sense where transactions costs are really low. And here there's a sense in which it's really cheap to opt in or opt out. But the more important set of costs here is this a question worth thinking about? What people are going to do with my commercial data? And for most people, I think the answer to that is no. There's an interesting study, actually, that estimates if people actually read the privacy notices online, they'd spend $780 billion in the opportunity cost of their time. What's at stake is an ad market that's $80 billion. That doesn't make any sense. It won't ever make any sense to spend much time and effort, that much time and effort, finding information and then thinking about it. So if for most people this is a question not worth thinking about, then in reality transactions costs are really high. And what we ought to think about is what consequences are we trying to avoid, and what can we do to actually reduce those consequences. It's do not call was one. Identity theft is obviously something we'd like to be able to control. I don't know that there's any evidence that any approach to notice or choice would do anything to reduce the risk of identity theft. It's just, it's a problem that needs to be addressed in a different way and with a different set of tools. Now, that said, there are people who care a lot about privacy. And I think Kara is exactly right. To the extent that those people are important in the marketplace, companies will serve them. They will go to those companies rather than others. But they'll do it because those companies will say, come to us, we've got what you want. Right? The way people get kosher hot dogs in the United States is not by reading a label that says not kosher somewhere in the fine print. That's the privacy policy approach. You get kosher hot dogs because somebody says mine is kosher. All right, buy mine. And I think privacy is the same way. To the extent that people want privacy controls, companies have incentives to offer those privacy controls, and those people have an incentive to use them. I do want to point out one piece of evidence that I think is particularly relevant to the opt-in, opt-out debate. If we think of this as a transactions cost problem, then a decision that for most people is not worth thinking about, then if we try to do this as a property right, the right is going to stay wherever we put it, because most people aren't going to think about it. There is some, and there's fairly clear experimental evidence for that in the opt-in, opt-out context. There is evidence, though, that people who care most about privacy make a more consistent set of choices. It doesn't matter as much to them whether the rule is opt-in or opt-out. They can protect their interest either way. The people who care can protect themselves, but they're not imposing costs on the people who think this is a question not worth thinking about. Of trying to wade through a privacy policy, and I think markets will provide that information and market privacy enhanced services if that's something that consumers value and are willing to pay for.
Great, thanks, Howard. Gail, let me turn over to you. I mean, this is your kind of bread and butter in this space. You see directly how this affects companies in the internet ecosystem. What's your take on that?
So the question being, do consumers have enough control over their privacy today?
Right.
So as John said, you haven't got a homogenous, you haven't got a monolith of companies when it comes to giving users control over their privacy. Oh, I beg your pardon, I'm going to speak into this. So I'll just repeat what I just said. So John made the point, very valid point, that there's no monolith when it comes to how companies extend user controls over privacy to their end users. And he talked about how some of the companies I represent, thankfully, are doing a really good job giving users granular controls. And then you go on down the long tail of the internet, and there are companies down there who are doing a less stellar job, I think it's fair to say. And I think the same applies to consumers. And I think what we're finding as our relationship with the internet grows and evolves and we become more sophisticated users of the internet, that consumers are showing different patterns, different ways of dealing with their own privacy, and that's something that I wanted to put out there up front. So I don't know that there's like a silver bullet approach to this. I think every consumer, as we've learned from the research, has a different approach to privacy and to the use of data by companies. I think we do know, however, that there is an acknowledged bargain, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say bargain instead of contract, Howard, but forgive me for going there, between U.S. consumers and companies. There's a reason why we have 2 billion monthly users of Facebook. There's a reason why half of US households are Amazon Prime members. So there's a bargain there. They see real value in the services being delivered, and they see value in the use of data by those companies. But at the same time, there's sophistication growing amongst consumers and end users as to how they manage their data once it's online. In doing some prep for this panel, noticed that Pew had come out with some research last September, which I think is quite telling, and shows a level of sophistication that we sometimes miss in these debates here in DC. So what Pew found in their research last September in a report called State of Privacy Post-Snowden is that 86% of Americans have taken steps to mask their digital footprints online. So that's masking your IP address. It can be the use of encrypted apps to communicate with others, things of that nature. And the other thing that they found was that these tools are being used even more by young Americans who were born digital, who really understand the technology and how to use it. So I think that's something that we should factor into this discussion today, because it speaks to the need for an opt-in or opt-out approach when it comes to data collection. But again, I would say I don't see a silver bullet here. I think there's a variety of options. We should talk about all of them. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks. John, I want to give you a chance to maybe expand a little bit and respond to some of what's been said since then. I mean, you spent a lot of time with privacy advocates. I would call Future Privacy Forum a privacy advocate.
I would not.
Okay.
I would disagree. I mean, we're a think tank.
Yeah.
I was general counsel at Epic for a number of years, and Epic for sure are privacy advocates. I was an advocate when I was there. I don't think Jules and I are privacy advocates, but we work with a lot of really smart, really sophisticated privacy advocates. Epic and EFF and others who are out there advocating on a day-to-day basis for Americans' privacy rights and individuals' privacy rights around the world, vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis companies, and vis-a-vis other individuals, I think are doing incredibly meritorious work. So yes, I have sat at that table. I have considered myself an advocate when I was in those roles. Now, I think we're sort of a think tank type organization. I believe our mission statement says we're a catalyst to drive responsible data practices, not in the sense of a chemical experiment, but in a slightly broader sense. Really, I promise. I said we wouldn't bite. We're not going to blow up the table either. It's going to be okay. I'm sorry, but you asked me to respond to some of the things that were said.
I'll ask you to respond, pretending you were back in Epic.
Sure.
Role play on this panel for a minute.
Sure, why not? That's always fun. That's sometimes fun.
What's the case for, because we still consistently hear this argument that it's a good thing, even though, as I think we heard, I mean, there's a lot of evidence, academic research that's saying, this isn't good when you look at the economic terms. It's not the optimal way of doing this. But we still see it, and we see this in GDPR, we see this in new proposals coming out. Why are privacy advocates still pushing that right now? What's the case to be made? How would they actually see that working, given the problems that we see?
Sure, yeah, so I'm happy to characterize that, and this also aligns with my general thinking on the issue, advocate, think tank, or not. I think that it's important to note a few things about what the typical case for opt-in is, right? I think the typical case for opt-in starts from the premise that privacy rights are rights, right? And it's great to have a conversation about economic efficiency. It's great to have a conversation about benefits to the individual, benefits to society, etc. But constitutional rights in this country, right to free speech, right to freedom of the press, lots of other rights, including the right to privacy, are not typically upheld or not upheld based on the economic efficiency and effectiveness of how those rights work in the real world. They are viewed as independent, freestanding obligations between and among us in society. And there's a basic understanding that respecting basic constitutional principles and rights, including the right to privacy, provides benefits to society and individuals that cannot easily be characterized in economic terms. That's why they're delineated as rights, right? That's why they're enforced as rights by courts and within society. So I think it starts from a rights-based approach. I think the argument for opt-in also is typically articulated in terms of basic consumer fairness, that if you want an individual to share data, agree to certain data uses, etc., that as a matter of basic consumer fairness, someone ought to meaningfully agree to that and make that bargain. Again, I'm not going to use the word contract, I'm going to use the word bargain, right? That said, I don't think that most advocates would characterize the case for opt-in as being opt-in is the appropriate characterization and treatment of every data collection, every use of data, every sharing of data, etc. There are some data collections that are so obviously implicit and part of a bargain. There are some data uses that are so clear to consumers and beneficial to consumers that having individual granular explicit affirmative consents for those collections and uses and sharing doesn't make a ton of sense, right? The real question is, when is opt-in appropriate, when is opt-out appropriate, or when is something like a forced choice or another mechanism appropriate for these data collections, these data uses, these data sharing principles?
What are the ones that you think are so obvious? Because when I talk to some of the privacy advocates, I'm not hearing them giving me a very long list here, so
Sure.
I'm curious what you've been hearing.
Sure, I'll give you a few. So let's say I go to an online retailer and I place an order, okay? And that order gets shipped to my house. It is, to me, so obviously implicit in that transaction that that online retailer has to share personal information about me with whomever their shipping provider is to send me that product, that I don't think that there's anyone out there making the case that I should have to opt in to data sharing between an online retailer and the U.S. Postal Service, Federal Express, etc., right? I go on, I order something, you're going to have to get it to me somehow. And I think consumers understand that online retailers typically don't run their own fulfillment. They just don't. I think that when I boot up an app and I have location enabled on my device and I ask an app where the nearest coffee shop is, whatever that brand of coffee shop is, that app is going to need to collect and use my location data in order to give me that answer. Now, that's irrespective of whether or not I have opted in to particular permissions on my device or within the app. I think it's just implicit in that transaction that, hey, I'm asking you to tell me where a coffee shop near me is, right? When I use a translation app and I enter information into that app, I think it's straightforward and obvious that that app is going to need to collect the words that I'm seeking to have translated in order to translate them back to me into Chinese or German or French, right? So, I mean, I could keep going, but I'm going to bore the heck out of everybody here. But I think there's a wide range of transactions that where the data collection, the data use, and the data sharing are so implicit in the agreement and in the transaction and in the context of the transaction that opt-in isn't appropriate, okay? But having said that, let's not pretend that the entire online ecosystem is a first-party ecosystem. It's not. We all know it's not, right? The typical transaction on the internet is not a transaction between me and the New York Times, where I say to the New York Times, I would like to read an article. Click. You have provided it to me. I have read it. I'm either a subscriber or I view some ads or, whatever the answer to that relationship is. That is a first-party transaction. The truth is there's lots of third parties serving advertisements, exchanging information, enabling me sharing that article on social media, who are not a part of that transaction. So the online ecosystem is complicated, and there are lots of data collections, uses, and sharing that are non-obvious to users. And I think the question becomes, when is it appropriate to have opt-in choices there? When is it appropriate to have opt-out choices there? When is it appropriate to have forced choices there? And then we can have a discussion. We can have a discussion about browsing history. We can have a discussion about search history. We can have a discussion about location. We can have a discussion about data related to health conditions and financial services and unique identifiers, right? But let's have that discussion rather than having a discussion of, hey, is opt-in appropriate in all cases? Is opt-out appropriate in all cases? I think when you have a framework that is set up ostensibly to protect privacy or to ensure privacy rights that is based on asking the question, is it more appropriate to have opt-in options all the time? Is it appropriate to have opt-out options all the time? I don't think that's a realistic discussion.
Well,
my 2 cents.
Thanks. So, Gail, let me turn it to you next. I mean, sticking with that, I mean, it seems like in Europe with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, they have kind of gone in that direction of saying, well, we are going to make one general comprehensive choice of opt-in. How is that going to affect companies that are developing products and services in Europe?
Thanks. So I'm going to take a little step back here and talk about Europe in general, because we encounter the European system on more than one policy front. And so, and then take a step back in time too, which is, we're at the beginning of the internet. It's sometime in the early 1990s. And the U.S. took a pretty enlightened decision to engage and allow the internet engage in what we now call permissionless innovation. And so it took a step back. It said, let's have this thing take off, and we'll figure out ways to deal with consumer protections. And they turned to the FTC, and so we have FTC enforcement coming out of that. And then in Europe, they took a different approach across a number of public policy issues, be it copyright, be it privacy, and the list goes on. And then more recently, they've engaged in their digital single market project, which is an effort to create an internal market for digital services throughout the 28 member states. And they've taken some heavy-handed approaches there, one of them being platform regulation, which is something that I don't think is going to happen, but it's a very different approach from the U.S. approach from the early 1990s to date. And I think it's fair to say, I think the jury's in, that you have a successful internet industry in this country. We represent 6% of GDP. We represent 3 million jobs. And you have an unsuccessful internet industry in Europe. And I'm not going to argue that public policy was the only reason why that came to pass, because there were other reasons. There was a lack of access to capital in their system. They have 19 different languages. It's hard to scale up in 19 different languages. But so there were differences. But I think public policy choices did play a role. And then within those public policy choices, you have privacy playing a role, and the GDPR that's coming on stream next May has played a role. And so going back to what John said, I hear what Europeans are saying. I'm actually one myself. The privacy is a human right paradigm. And it's kind of a zero-sum thing, right? We saw it in the Privacy Shield. It was like you can't argue, you can't make economic arguments to us, which, let me tell you, is really hard coming from a trade association. So that's kind of our bread and butter, because privacy is a human right. This is a zero-sum game. And I think the better balance is struck in this country. And I know people struggle with seeing it through an economic lens, but there's good on both sides.
Thanks. Kara, this is also, an area that you focused on quite a bit. How do you see, this kind of playing out in the European context? And, also, as John mentioned, there's this kind of question of what's obvious versus non-obvious. And it seems to me that, in the digital space, especially, increasingly, you have so much complexity that everything is going to be non-obvious in the future. I'm still not exactly sure how my drone works, right? Like I get the concept, but so there's a lot of complexity here, and it's all data processing. Where Europe seems to have been moving in this real kind of extreme situation, and to give a kind of a concrete example of how I see it, in the UK there's a recent debate about one of the hospitals, and it was testing some use of machine learning for diagnostics, and using your framing. I would think as a patient, when I go to the doctor and they perform some test on me, that test goes through some process. I know it's not, the doctor herself or himself who's actually doing the testing. It's going to go to some lab tech. That's going to go into some systems. The data is going to, be looked at by some people, and it comes back, and the doctor tells me something. In the same sense, when you have, increasingly hospitals using technology that data may go to a tech company, a traditionally, maybe someone outside the firm, just like in the past you've had radiologists that are outsourced or overseas. So there doesn't seem to be a big distinction here, but in that context specifically, the UK privacy regulator has stepped in and said, we need to be careful about how we're sharing this data. We need to have informed user consent before that happens. But in the kind of the traditional analog world, you would never have that consent that, this technician is going to be seeing my lab results, this technician will be seeing this result. So Kara, I mean, as companies are thinking about this, they're trying to operate in this very complex environment, both in Europe and the United States. How are they able to kind of bridge that gap of one set of rules here, another set of rules there, that are coming from very different places?
Yeah. I mean, I think the reality, what a lot of, especially larger companies are looking at now, is GDPR is likely going to be their minimum standard across the world. As a company, when you're operating globally, it's not always easy to just fragment, okay, we're going to do this for Europeans and this for Americans, because the data doesn't work that way. And I personally think, it's kind of agreeing with Gail, kind of the U.S. approach, which is more risk-based, I think is kind of the better direction for companies to operate. But at the same time, GDPR is a regulation now. It's coming into effect in May. It's kind of the new reality that companies have to live with. And I think one of my concerns in terms of looking at the impact on consumers is the potential for kind of this idea of analysis paralysis, where sometimes, especially looking at kind of GDPR, the definition of personal data is so broad that you as a consumer are all of a sudden getting notifications and opt-in questions for a lot of things, and you don't necessarily have the ability to differentiate between, is this something that is sensitive data to me, or is this something I don't really care about, because you're kind of seeing the same or similar kind of opt-in policies over and over again. So I think that's kind of one concern I have with an opt-in only approach. Kind of to John's point about there are different ways that you need to look at that, and I think GDPR reflects that a little bit in their inclusion of ideas like legitimate consent, kind of moving beyond, or legitimate interest, moving on just from a consent-based model, but actually including in GDPR other ways for data processing to occur. I think that's one important aspect of GDPR, that's not just this is a consent-only model to follow. And then also kind of getting to beyond kind of the definition of personal data, I think too kind of our understanding of privacy evolves, and our understanding of the data ecosystem evolves. When you were talking about the online retailer, I was automatically thinking, I also think often when I buy something from an online retailer, I automatically kind of know, okay, I'm going to start receiving things mail probably from J.Crew or wherever I'm buying something from. And sometimes that's an opt-in. Sometimes if it's, I was working with a realtor to find a house in DC, and I clicked on an ad that she had, and then all of a sudden started receiving mail. So it's kind of one of those things, it's not always, you don't always know, but if it's helping me find a house, maybe I'm interested in the end. So I think kind of the evolution of how we understand the data ecosystem is important as well, and it's going to continue to evolve because technology is evolving. We're about to enter this kind of era of Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, and that's going to really change the way that we interact. Right now we think of it a lot, and when we think of opt-in, or at least when I think of opt-in, I often think of like a screen, and I check a box if I agree. But when you have kind of a virtual reality headset, I know I was talking to a gaming company where they were talking about eventually they wanted you to be able to blink when you want to, pay to play a game, or your privacy policy would be a blink that you agree. So there's kind of an evolving way to think about a lot of these privacy issues, and I think that's an important component as well. And a regulation like GDPR, while some of it is written in there, I think it also depends on how it's enforced and the ability of kind of the data protection authorities to allow all of this system to evolve and not kind of just hold true to this kind of traditional opt-in consent model.
Howard, it sounded like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on John's notion that there are uses of data that consumers, that are implicit in the transaction, but I don't see the distinction between first-party uses of that data and third-party uses of that data, which is really more about how do you organize the production of this service. I think an interesting example is credit card processing, where consumers have no idea how this whole system works. You make a charge, it appears on your bill, and it may go through the hands of 4 or 5 different processors in the course of getting it from the merchant to your bank that issued your credit card. Not to mention fraud control screening of that transaction by the credit card networks. There's an enormous amount of information exchange that has to happen for that transaction to occur, and it doesn't matter whether it's first party or third party. The question is how do you organize it? The other problem with thinking about it as a first party, third party thing is where that creates a tremendous advantage is to the sign-in services, Google and Facebook, where you have to sign in. You've explicitly consented in any meaningful way to their uses of the information when you signed up for the service. And other people can produce very similar products like advertising. They can sell advertising and the same kinds of advertising in the same kind of way as Google and Facebook can, but not if you say you can't share the information. All right, it's only Google and Facebook that can sell advertising, and I think that's great if you're Google and Facebook. I'm not so sure it's good for the rest of us.
Okay. I want to come back to, Kara, a comment that you had made about GDPR being the minimum standard globally. We're having this conversation, obviously, here in the United States, where I think that kind of message should be troubling in the sense of asking this question about, why is European policy, why is the EU able to define, a policy not only that will impact the U.S. but define a policy that will be global? When we tried to devise, internet policy in a kind of a multi-stakeholder approach, where we tried to, very carefully limit impact outside of the borders. So I'll open up to the panel about who wants to respond to this. But I want to put that question out there. How should we be troubled by this? Should we be troubled? Yes. Great. Let's try it one more time. All right. So should we be troubled with this development, and what should the response be? Especially, we have an administration that has very clearly said they want kind of an America First policy in trade and other economic areas. What might that look like? So again, this is to anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I don't have a solution, but I would very clearly say we should be troubled, and we should be troubled particularly because I don't know why this doesn't translate to a political context. I mean, do we really want China to be able to set the standard? Because if you want to do what information can be communicated over the network, because if you're going to operate in China, you have to do it the same way? I think not. They can have their own great firewall, but to the extent that gets imposed on us, we really wouldn't like it at all, and it would really violate fundamental American principles. What is at stake in the European data regulation isn't that extreme, but what's troubling about it is I don't know why it would be any different. If we were talking about political information or Russian hate speech.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do we push back on that? I mean, what should be done in that context of if it's not a good thing? Do we just live with it, or what can be done? Gail,
so look, the economic case is from the EU. If you want to do business with us, if you want to be interoperable with our system, this is the price of doing business. So you have to harmonize up to our standard, because we're not harmonizing down to your standard. And I think we see that again in the Privacy Shield context. We had the fierce debate about standards and interoperability, but those are the concessions that were made. But I think with the administration that we have now, and I don't want to speculate too much, but I think it's possible we will see more truth speaking to the Europeans, because when you look at what happened in the Privacy Shield, you had this extraordinary lineup of DPAs who had independence and did not report into the European Commission, who was doing the negotiation. They also had no jurisdiction over their own surveillance apparatus in their own countries, and so they had more control, more jurisdiction over U.S. surveillance law and policy because of Privacy Shield, or then Safe Harbor, than they did over their own agencies. And I can't imagine a scenario where this administration wouldn't push back on that and speak truth to the Europeans, and then also demand perhaps some reciprocity in return. But again, I'm speculating, and I don't speak for the administration.
Certainly.
Yeah, I want to pick up on kind of the comment of data transfers in the Privacy Shield. One of the kind of biggest concerns for me that I see in kind of a GDPR approach is really kind of the international transfer mechanism, where the European Union really relies on this adequacy list, this essential equivalence of countries, in order for companies that are located in that country to transfer data back and forth, which is the reason that we have the Privacy Shield between the US and the EU. And what concerns me about that is, while it's very troublesome in the EU context, and sometimes when I read through GDPR, I don't really understand the need for such a list when there's extraterritoriality in GDPR as well. But that's kind of another point. But anyway, I think what concerns me even more is that a lot of other countries, especially in like Latin America, some in Asia, are kind of picking up this approach. And it's really kind of going to end up fragmenting the digital ecosystem, or the global digital ecosystem. And the ability kind of, while it's solved kind of in the US-EU context, a lot of companies don't just transfer data between the US and the EU. A lot of companies also transfer data to Brazil or Malaysia, back and forth. And so for a company to kind of have to figure out a way to, okay, well, the U.S. is adequate, so I can transfer data through the Privacy Shield between the EU, but Brazil is not adequate, so it has to go back to the EU, and then we can go down to Brazil. I feel like that creates kind of a lot of challenges on the data flows aspect, and I think especially when we work with a lot of small businesses, looking at their ability to operate in some of these markets, it really harms small businesses and startups even more than kind of global corporations that can really figure out how to operate with that in that system and have the ability to move around. So that's one of my big concerns with GDPR as well.
Mm-hmm. John, did you want to weigh in?
Just very briefly.
Sorry, and I'll just say, so clearly the microphones are having issues, so we'll try and speak loudly for those in the back.
Sure. I was born and raised in New Jersey. I can speak loudly. If we're going to try to fill the room without the mics, no worries. So, just a couple of quick points. I think, Daniel, you're exactly right to be skeptical of data localization mandates, to be skeptical of mechanisms that impose burdensome requirements on cross-border data transfers. But I think that the key to this is, and I know this is not a particularly intellectually stimulating position, it's not a particularly interesting position, but I think it's vital, is what we need to do is we need to support the practical mechanisms for cross-border data transfers. Whether it's Privacy Shield between the US and the EU, whether it's cross-border privacy rules in the APAC region, the hard work of ensuring that the systems are interoperable, not harmonized, but interoperable across borders, is the actual guts of maintaining the free and open internet that we enjoy today. And as I said, it's not something that is highfalutin, it's not something that is a big treaty negotiation between nations, but it is the hard work of actually ensuring that those cross-border data transfer mechanisms are meaningful in terms of their privacy protections, that they are adhered to, that they are enforced against, and that they serve the needs of global companies and international companies around the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where the hard work is.
And so, I mean, it seems like the challenge, though, as we get into this kind of globalized space, is if we see problems with one country or one region's approach to privacy and data protection, and that becomes the baseline. It's just kind of pushing everything up. How do we balance those trade-offs? Because in the European context, as Gail mentioned, I mean, the data protection authorities have enormous influence. One of the biggest challenges we see when we're having conversations with European policymakers is not that we can't find plenty of people over there who understand the benefits of data-driven innovation. It's that they're not the ones that have the most power in terms of actually setting the policy. The Article 29 Working Group, which is basically all the data protection authorities, they have significant influence and they're able to shape the policy, and they don't really have the counterbalance. In the United States, we see, I think, a lot more equality in the policy debate. So you kind of have one interest overrepresented, and then that one interest is now not only overrepresented in European policy, but it's overrepresented now globally. So I think you're right, John, that there's this question of not just harmonization, but interoperability. But I think beyond that, there's still a question of how do we make sure that, in the U.S. context, especially if we're talking about U.S. policy, how do we make sure we're still capturing those benefits of data, recognizing that we also, at the same time, have to balance the need for interoperability? So let me put that one back to you first, since you maybe led me to that question.
Sure. So I think it's a challenging question. I think one way I might approach it is by questioning a basic assumption about opt-in and opt-out. Okay? And I think that there's been a basic assumption about opt-in and opt-out and privacy defaults generally for a while now. And that assumption is that when a company or an entity provides a product or service that implicates personal data, they make a decision about the default settings for various data flows, various data collection, use, sharing, etc. And then they apply those defaults across their user base. As a practical matter, that's how most entities do business. The truth is, the internet ecosystem and data-driven innovation has provided entities with lots of information about individuals, including information about those individuals' privacy preferences. Right? So when I change the settings on an app on my mobile device, when I do a privacy checkup on Facebook, when I make decisions on the Google account dashboard about how I want my data handled, that's all information that those entities have about me in terms of my privacy preferences. And I think that the future, in terms of supporting the notion of in the United States, that this stuff is beneficial to consumers, beneficial to the American economy, and really critical for innovation moving forward, is I think regulators and entities and users are going to have to start wrapping their heads around the idea that when a new product or service rolls out from an entity that has information about my privacy preferences, my default might be different than Kara's. And her default might be different than Howard's. And that's a sea change. That's not the world we live in today. The world we live in today is regulators ask the question, what was your default? Why did you set it that way? And how did that impact consumers? But I think they're going to have to start asking questions about what was John's default? Why was it set that way? And how did it impact him? And I think that will help us thread the needle a little bit on having users more bought in to trust in the ecosystem, and having companies more comfortable with the idea that various users in their user base aren't just going to tweak privacy defaults, but they may have different defaults to begin with.
I'm going to add a layer of complication to that, but I think even an individual person has different kind of privacy personas. So how I operate at work and kind of what I look at on my work browser that might be under my name is different than how I kind of operate in home. So I think that even adds another layer of complication to it.
So there was a recent study out of the University of Chicago Law School that asked consumer preferences or privacy for a dating app. So it showed, this was kind of an experiment, it showed participants two privacy policies. One was kind of the classic policy, and then one was highly invasive. It said the app would collect very sensitive information, sexual history, and then sell that information to third-party advertisers. And they found that consumers' willingness to use the app was the same regardless of what the privacy policy said and whether the participants had actually read it or not. That seems to kind of build off what you're saying. You need to kind of get more user involvement and choice. But we see some of these studies that are kind of saying sometimes it doesn't even matter. The companies are you show the information and the users still do the same thing. Are privacy notices effective? Do we need to change what we're doing in this space? Do we need to change? And we talked at the very beginning about some of these controls. Howard, maybe I'll start with you on this. What should companies be doing to both be very transparent about what they're doing, but still ensure they can collect and use data where appropriate?
I mean, companies ultimately have to keep their customers happy. So in that sense, they've got to do what their customers want. But I don't know that most of their customers want to know very much about the details of how information is used or how it's processed. It's a good thing that most people don't have to know the details of how the credit card system works. Not a bad thing. And when that happens digitally and on the internet, as opposed to in the older technologies, doesn't seem to me to make any difference in what people are willing to share. The dating app is interesting because it seems to me that the fundamental choice. I mean, you're obviously going to have to share information if you want to build a relationship. The fundamental choice is: are you willing to do that online or not? So that's the big question. And the people who say, "Yeah, I'll do that online," it's not all that surprising that they make pretty much the same choice, regardless of how you describe that. There is some evidence, and a colleague of mine has done a variety of surveys using vignettes, and you ask people whether a particular information use involving a particular actor and involving a particular kind of information is, or to what extent is that consistent with your privacy expectations. And what comes out of that research is that privacy expectations are very contextual. They change a lot in different circumstances. And one of her examples, which I think is an interesting one, it's regulators tend to say this is sensitive information, you can't share it. But sharing sensitive health information with your doctor doesn't violate anybody's privacy expectations. It's not, what you're giving up is information, not privacy. And whether there's a violation of privacy or not depends on what happens with that information. And in particular, as I said at the beginning, I think the key question is it used in ways that are against the interests of that consumer and without substantial offsetting benefits.
Yeah.
So I'm familiar with the study that Dan referenced earlier on because I had the joy of moderating a panel between the writer of the study, Omri Ben-Shahar, who is from the University of Chicago Law School, and Julie Brill, and boy, did they go at it. But the survey is quite extraordinary if you want to understand better the usefulness of privacy policies from one academic standpoint. And so what Omri did was put out a number of different formats for a disclosure policy, again, to do with a dating app. But some of the questions asked were really very, very sensitive questions. I mean, the respondents were asked if they'd ever had an STD, and there were all kinds of warning labels put on some of these questions. And it seemed that the consumers had the same response regardless of how the privacy policy, the notice, was packaged. And so the findings that he took from that were that, they saw little or no change in the comprehension of the disclosure by the end user, their willingness to share personal information, and their expectations about their privacy rights. So Julie's response to that, I'll channel my own boss a little bit here, was that you have to take a step back and look beyond the notices and talk about privacy in a much wider setting. And so how companies think about privacy is much broader and deeper than just notices and disclosures. It's privacy by design. It's reading those FTC consent decrees, and disclosures are a piece of that. And the other thing she said was that you have to think about different audiences for the disclosures too. We always think about the consumer's response, but you're also signaling to the marketplace in your privacy policy to other companies. You're signaling to regulators and so on. So there are different audiences for disclosures, and they can be effective in different ways with those different audiences.
Great. So I want to open it up to audience question. Again, if you're watching online, you're welcome to submit questions using the hashtag ITIF privacy. You can also just raise your hand if you're in the room. I have one question before we do that, though, just last one for the panel, and that's kind of moving in a different direction of government data collection. Right now, there's an open request for comment on DHS's collection of social media data of naturalized citizens or anyone kind of involved in the immigration system, and it would be asking for social media and other accounts. And there's where you see kind of this overlap between what industry does and then the impact that might have on the data that government can have. Does anyone want to comment on what implications some of that other government policy can have on industry overall, and how that affects this general internet ecosystem?
To me, privacy vis-a-vis the government is very different than privacy vis-a-vis companies, and we probably ought to be more protective than we are of making it hard for the government to get information that companies have without a really good reason, and probably without a particularized reason. I think the social media stuff is, as I assume what they want is this information as part of an application or for citizenship or for a visa or for whatever, and that's a little bit different because there's going to be some investigation there in any event. Of trying to figure out who you are and what you're about, so it raises somewhat different issues. But I think it really is troubling if the government can get without a warrant, without even suspicion, information that companies have collected that may reveal a great deal.
I guess maybe if you want to respond, I can maybe characterize the question just a little bit and say. We've been talking about disclosure and transparency somewhat. Do companies have any kind of, if and when this policy occurs, and it seems like it will occur, do companies need to do anything to be transparent to the user about not what they're doing, but what the implications for their privacy are in terms of what the government's doing?
Yeah, well, I think more transparency is better than less transparency on all of these issues. So, but we're not there yet. I can tell you that we have publicly opposed the proposal. In one of the reasons, so beyond what Howard spoke to, was because, as with a lot of things that happen in the U.S., because the companies are global companies and 80% of their end users are overseas, there's always a concern about the precedent-setting effect of something like that happening here in the U.S. and what that signals to other countries like China, Turkey, Russia, so on.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, we'll open it up when we have a mic. First. Right up here, and then we'll.
Hello? I don't know that it's working.
It'll be good for the.
It is. We can hear it.
So I'm good.
We'll get it for the camera, so it is working for the stream.
Okay. So this is really a question for Howard, and the others can chime in as well. I think that when we use economic arguments, they fall on deaf ears a little bit with the Europeans because all they're hearing is like money for businesses. Is there a way that we can make an economic argument but make it very consumer focused, such as if we went to an all opt-in regime, consumers would be deprived of X, Y, and Z. Consumers would no longer have access. We try to make those arguments, but I'm not sure we make them in a way that will resonate with the Europeans and the others and advocates. So I'm turning to the economists in the room to think about how we can better formulate those arguments.
It's a complicated argument, I think, well, no, I don't even know that it's all that complicated. I mean, I think the value proposition in a lot of internet activities is the same value proposition as broadcast television. I mean, here's this free stuff, and you're going to have to put up with these commercials in order to get it. And where information use factors into that is that it is nobody wants to advertise to somebody who they have no idea who they are. The value of the advertising that provides the money for content is a lot higher if you've got some information about who this is than if you know nothing. I've done surveys, one that was a survey of advertising networks and another that looked at data from auction markets, and what you find is where there's tracking information that's used to target the advertisement, the price is about 3 times higher than where you don't know anything. And the more you know, the higher the price of the advertisement. In the one study where we could vary the amount of knowledge. The longer, in particular, to be concrete about it, the longer a cookie had been on somebody's machine, the higher the price of advertising on that machine. That's the economic case. Is what's providing all this content that people like is advertising, and if consumers want that without having to pay for it. There's got to be a model that provides revenue to the people who produce it, and the one we've got now is advertising that depends on information. And if you do, and then the last step is, if you do opt in, you're going to have a lot less information.
I'm glad to see, John, that you can play privacy advocate. When you're called upon to do so, I don't understand why ITIF didn't have a consumer representative on this panel.
Come on up, Bob.
It's not my role. I want to make a comment. It seems to me that the way you frame the discussion about opt-in and opt-out kind of implies that all the privacy rules, whatever they happen to be, are either opt-in or opt-out. And I think that that's unfortunate. I think that the economic arguments about transaction costs, some of them go away if you have rules that apply and no one needs to negotiate. We do that in a lot of areas of where consumers interact with businesses, and we write rules that say there have to be things done in a certain way. Billing is done in a certain way. You get a bill every month from the phone company because there's a rule. You don't have to negotiate with the phone company how often they're going to send you a bill. We have warranties that are standardized so consumers don't have to negotiate with businesses, and the same thing can work in privacy. And even if you don't want to accept the human rights arguments about privacy, we can find a way to avoid or reduce transaction costs by setting up privacy rules that everyone can follow.
Thanks.
Well, I think we don't have rules about warranties other than the way they're disclosed, and that certain information has to be in big type. But there's common law warranties that are torts. I mean, the heart of my argument that we shouldn't be worried about notice and choice, we should worry about consequence, is for rules. I would prefer common law rules that say, that look at each case, rather than rules that apply across the board and say everybody's got to do this thing this way. But it's a rule that's about the problem, not about the information.
I was going to say, I also think it's actually very interesting what the FTC is working on right now around their upcoming workshop on information harms, because I think this is one of the first times that I'm seeing the FTC really address head-on this question of, instead of looking at this issue from the perspective of, privacy and control from the traditional lens of data collection control, it's looking at it from the perspective of what are the impacts, the harmful impacts on users. Can we identify what they are? Can we identify the spectrum of harm? And then can we identify the remedies necessary to address those? And so, when we talk about, ways to minimize, create consistent rules, I think some of that is about addressing the harm side of this. because I think once you've addressed the harms, you negate the reason most people actually have a privacy concern in the first place. So you kind of move away from even having to engage in that debate, because there's just broader consensus on the fact that, for example, if revealing my social security number does not put me at any kind of credit risk, and I have no problem with sharing my social security number with anyone. So when you make those balances, and you end up with, I think, a different policy environment. We had a question back there.
I've had an opportunity to participate in this debate for a little over 20 years now, since it first started in the mid-'90s, and I wanted to make a couple of observations and then a question. One is, I think, for those of you who follow the Nobel Prize in Economics, Nobel Prize winner addressed this point precisely. His textbook example of a consumer not making an economically logical decision was opt-in versus opt-out, and that 99% of the people, when you have opt-in, opt-out, 99% of the people take no choice, and if you have to opt one way or another, you will simply go with the flow. So for the vast majority, we've known for 20 years that the vast majority of consumers will simply take the default, whatever the default is, whether it's highly restrictive or highly flexible. Secondly, I think Howard made the most important point, which is that 22 years ago we began this journey with the assumption that this would be a matter of contract law, not regulation. And the assumption of that, underlying that, was that informed consumers could make a decision. They need to be informed and need to make a choice. What happened in the intervening 22 years was not what we expected, and in a very important way that Howard himself explained. No one envisioned back in 1995 that if you choose opt-in, you have to read the 17-page contract, and if you choose opt-out, you have to read the 27-page contract. And why that happened probably has more to do with the litigation bar than it has anything else, but it is what it is. The contract model is on the defense, to put it politely, and may be about to become extinct. The question I have is there something we can do to preserve the contract model? And the specific thought that occurred to me was, if you go way back to the beginning, the first notices were, we're not collecting any data whatsoever, period, end of disclosure. Or, we collect data but we don't share it with anybody. A 3-line disclosure. The contract was something that a 6th grader could read. Is there any way to go back, to turn the clock back, and go back to clear and conspicuous disclosures so that you could preserve the contract model, which I think is superior to the regulatory model, but it can't survive in the legal structure that we have today. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I think
the answer, because nobody can hear you back there.
I think the only way you can have simple notices like you describe is to have simple rules about what you do with the information as a company. That if my policy is I don't collect any information, it's really easy for me to tell you that and market it. If my policy is I collect information but I don't give it to anybody, it's really easy for me to tell you that and market that to you if it's something you care about. The policies are complex because the information practices are complex, and trying to explain all of the things, trying to explain all of the ways information changes hands in order to place any advertisement on your screen on a website is not a simple thing to do. And there is no way to do it in a way that is simple and easy for consumers to understand. I mean, it's a complicated problem. And I think the other part of it is if you want simpler privacy policies, you got to leave stuff out, and nobody's willing to say you could leave that out.
Questioner.
Thank you. A lot of the discussions that the panel has had today, I noticed, don't really talk about sort of the incidental data uses, which I think a lot of the privacy groups in particular are more worried about. So not so much the third parties that are helping get that package to your house or pick out your favorite groceries, but in some ways the data broker industry or other incidental data uses. I'd love to hear the panel talk about opt-in and opt-out in that context.
Sure. Karen, maybe you.
You can take it first, yeah.
I mean, to me, the incidental data uses are an absolutely classic case of why we ought to focus on whether there's a harm here. Because most of those, I mean, a lot of incidental data uses are things people never thought of at the time the data was collected. A lot of the sharing of that information turns out to be quite valuable for very useful purposes. A lot of fraud control tools are based on incidental uses of data that was like subscription lists that was collected for completely different purposes. It's meaningless, I think, to try to get consumers to consent to that, and counterproductive to the goal of a good fraud detection tool, which is useful to everybody. And the incidental uses that we don't know about because we haven't thought of them yet. I don't see why we want to prohibit them because we didn't ask consumers at the time. Can we use this for things we haven't thought of yet? Which I don't know what to say to that question.
Yeah, I agree with kind of the more risk-based approach. And kind of one example, there was kind of an informal study done at a hospital where babies, when they were born, were monitored for like a certain fever. There was a certain disease, I forget the name of it, they were kind of catching after 24 hours. So the nurses kind of did their own in-house experiment monitoring, if they took this action before or when the fever started, how did that end up kind of helping it. And they found that if they had taken the action to kind of reduce this fever or give them this pill before the fever was brought on. I'm telling this story horribly, I apologize. But anyway, at the end of it is they found out that basically by monitoring this behavior that was not necessarily what they're there to do, they were able to kind of figure out how to take preventative steps to combat this disease. Now, did the kind of nurses have consent for this? I don't think so, but it was in kind of that ability, that daily ability, which sometimes is just an incidental use of that data. And so I think those are important examples. Kind of that's one, and I think that can happen kind of throughout the data ecosystem. And I think there's also a point that kind of came up earlier in a little bit in what Howard was saying. I've heard a lot of my friends that were kind of concerned about the recent Equifax security breach, and they kind of brought up, I feel like my privacy rights have been violated by this, and I don't remember consenting to this or whatever. But really, I think there's a kind of confusion between the relationship between privacy and security, and kind of the security aspect, that's another side and kind of another conversation, but in some way related to kind of keeping that information private is making sure that companies kind of have those security protections in place. And I think a lot of consumers kind of get the two confused, and I think that especially happens in kind of the incidental uses of data. And so then they think automatically, well, I would prefer an opt-in approach over an opt-out approach because I'm worried about the security of my data. But really, the security of the data doesn't matter if it's an opt-in or an opt-out approach.
So just to pick up on your example, back before the Europeans worried about these things, the guy who figured out typhoid in London was a waterborne disease did it by following people to the pump that was contaminated and tracing the epidemic back to people who used a common pump as their source of water. But that was very much an incidental data use.
Other questions?
Although some consumers are definitely more privacy savvy than others, there's still an institutional problem of information asymmetry and data privacy, which does affect commercial incentives and privacy practices for the companies. And I would argue that this kind of undercuts the free market argument that consumers will be driven towards whatever company has the best privacy practices if they don't know. and just because they don't know doesn't mean that they don't care or they're not harmed by it. So how would you account for information asymmetry and ultimately the lack of informed consent into the economic analysis of privacy harms and risk analysis?
Thank you. Maybe Howard?
The way we do it everywhere else except privacy is people who have a product or a feature that consumers want explain, buy my product because you want that feature. And there's no reason in the world why that can't work with privacy. If I'm a company with privacy features, I can sell it to people who want to buy that. It's my kosher hot dog example. We don't rely on explaining to all consumers the process by which a typical hot dog is made and how this one differs, which I think is sort of the explain everything to consumers approach. We rely on the guy whose hot dog is kosher saying, buy mine, it's kosher. That's what works. That's what gets information to consumers and gets them to act on it.
You don't look satisfied with the answer, so do you want to expand on it maybe?
Well, I was just thinking more about the information asymmetry on the issues that consumers may care about, like third-party uses that go beyond the services that are necessary to facilitate the transaction. What about if it goes to be a broker? So I was thinking more in terms of other actual risks that could happen by the lack of information that consumers have, even if they don't read the price policies. The ones that do have policies often have discrepancies between the actual data practices and what's actually disclosed. So how do we account for this in the
Well, I think it's if there's an actual problem, if this is causing some harm to some consumers, I think that's what we ought to be worried about, and that we don't want to rely on contract there. We want to say stop doing this bad thing. In the places where we don't know whether consumers care or not, or we don't know which consumers care or not, or how much consumers care, that's where we ought to rely on markets to say, and the ability of sellers to say, I've got a product that has the feature you want. And to sell it that way. That's what overcomes the information asymmetry, not a detailed explanation of what everybody does that I then have to try to sort through to find that this guy has a policy that says I don't share with third parties.
Kara, can we get your take on it?
Yeah, I think on one point, if a company is saying this is my privacy policy, but they're not following that in practice, that's a completely kind of separate issue from kind of the opt-in and consenting. I think the privacy policy, part of that has to have the correct information, whether you're opting in or not. But I think on the other hand, when I think about privacy policies, and there's been this idea of kind of creating like a nutrition label privacy policy. But when I think about that, I don't necessarily think that works, because when I go to the grocery, I don't read the nutrition label on every single thing that I'm buying, even if it's a brand new product. I don't sit there and okay, and look through that. And maybe there are some people that do that and read that closely. Maybe they're the same people that read a privacy policy very, very closely. But I think that's kind of the difference where not always, while a blanket approach might seem like the solution, it's not necessarily always the best way.
John, did you want to weigh in on this? I'll give you the last word.
Sure. I'll just flag that one of the ways folks deal with information asymmetry is exactly what Howard described, right? Which is that we rely on folks to advertise features that they think are selling it to consumers. The other way is government regulation, right? So those hot dogs, whether they're kosher or not, are subject to food safety regulations that everybody agrees there's a real harm in having food that is unsafe, that is spoiled, that causes folks to get sick. And we have agreed on, in a rough way, a rough kind of consensus, around where the threshold for risk ought to be in terms of food safety of hot dogs. And that threshold is probably not no one in America will ever get sick from a hot dog, and it is probably not everybody in America will get sick from hot dogs all the time, but it is somewhere that we as a society have landed on a rough consensus about food safety on hot dogs, and we've got guardrails, right? And it's a combination of those regulatory requirements around food safety and that gets into the information asymmetry about whether or not a consumer can look at a hot dog and determine whether or not it's safe to eat, and whether a consumer can look at a hot dog and figure out whether or not it's kosher, Consumers can't do either. So you've got to figure out when it's appropriate to have regulation and when it's appropriate to let the market determine through marketing and other means.
Just to add one more thing, and I think that's really important in terms of where enforcement comes in. So like the example you gave of the privacy policy, they weren't practicing in the same way, or in that example especially. That's what makes kind of enforcing what regulations we have in place very important. One of the things I hear a lot is, oh, the U.S. doesn't have a privacy policy because it doesn't have an EU-style, all across sectors approach. But we have very strong sector-by-sector approach that is heavily enforced. And I kind of think that's, at the end of the day, you can have a great regulation on the books, but if no one's enforcing it, it doesn't really matter.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad we didn't serve hot dogs today, because I don't know if that would have gone well. Well, thank you to our panelists for being here today. Thank you to everyone for your questions and comments. I think this has been a useful conversation. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you. I should have mentioned at the beginning, we did have copies, I think, on the chairs of some recent blogs and reports, so we welcome you to take those.
So in the right to be forgotten department, you know where you got this?
Oh, I think it's from a previous event you did with us.
Okay.